Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. We'd like to thank you for once again listening to the Hello, Old Sports podcast. Andrew, how are you today?
I am doing excellent, Dan. I am just digging out from a blizzard we had here in the Northeast, New York, Pennsylvania, Jersey, southern New England area. We got pretty well blanketed with it on Monday. So had a day off work, and I know a lot of people are still dealing with it. So I'm excited to put that in the rear view and go back to a time when basketballs had laces in them, basketball shorts had belts in them, and baskets themselves had bottoms to them.
So we've been doing this. I think we've done about 17 episodes so far, and I think I should note that we're sort of recording this in sort of a strange time period. We're going to have to take a week or two off from recording, and then we've got some other things coming up with the show. We have a Super Bowl trivia episode that we did that we thought would be airing before the Super Bowl, but that's unfortunately has not happened now. So we've kind of, we're not sure as we record this when some of these various episodes are going to air throughout the month of February and into early March. But
Dan is being diplomatic. We are holding out for more money. The last day of our contract, and we are now holding out as part of a negotiation.
So we, as you know, if you're a regular listener, we spent most of January doing football-related episodes. We did our QB Mount Rushmores, which was 2 episodes. We did an episode on Super Bowl 25, which we really enjoyed doing. We did... and then before that, we'd done quite a few baseball episodes. We did our Yankee all-time team, our New York National League all-time team. We did an episode on the Baseball Hall of Fame. We've done episodes on boxing, but we haven't done any basketball-specific episodes yet. And we decided that February, as football ends and as the winter sports heat up, we thought that this would be a good time to dive into some basketball topics. So just to give you an idea of sort of what we have on tap, we have later in the month, we have an episode, at least one, maybe 2, on all-time starting 5s for each NBA team, similar to what we did with the quarterback Mount Rushmore. We have our first ever author interview coming up in a couple weeks on Hello Old Sports with Paul Nepper, who wrote a book called The Knicks of the 90s, which is a great book, and we're looking forward to talking to him about that. It's a favorite topic of Andrew and I, the Knicks of the 90s. We are likely to do an episode in early March about LaSalle basketball, Andrew's alma mater, and talk about some of the great moments and figures in the history of LaSalle basketball. But we thought it would be a good place to start this week with sort of looking at the history of the NBA, and maybe not the whole history, but looking at sort of the NBA and then sort of some of the rival leagues that have sort of risen up throughout the decades that the NBA has been in existence, whether that's the ABA, whether that's some of the leagues that came before, and sort of talk about those leagues, what those leagues were, and then how they impacted the NBA and brought about whether it was expansion or just changes within the NBA to one extent or another. We anticipate that this will be the first in a series. We're going to do this with football in another month or so. We're going to eventually do this with baseball. And so this idea of competitor leagues to the main league, whether that's the NFL, whether that's the NBA, or whether that's the Major League Baseball. So we'll sort of talk about how those leagues, how competitor leagues became rival leagues, how competitor leagues became equals, and how some of them just sort of faded away. And so that is the topic for tonight, as we talk about some of the rival leagues that have developed in the world of professional basketball through the years and through the decades. Before we start, I would just like to encourage you, as always, to interact with the show. Find us on Facebook at Hello World Sports Podcast. Email us at helloworldsports@gmail.com. Please follow, rate, and review us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. We're excited for a new year. We sort of, between the Super Bowl stuff and the In Memoriam, which lasted for most of December, we're sort of locked in on a couple of different themes. But now that those things have gone away, now that we're into February and March, we can sort of go all over the place, and we're really excited about that. Andrew, did you have anything to add before we got started?
No, you're right. I think I say this on my weekly show, which is more about current sports, but the NFL takes a lot of oxygen when it's going on. And football is my favorite sport, and the NFL specifically. But it's whenever the NFL is on or having a big off-season thing like the draft or the start of free agency, it's always in the center ring. So even on a show that's devoted to sports history, it's hard not to talk a lot about football in the playoffs and the lead up to the Super Bowl. But now that's, by the time this airs over and we're in what passes for an NFL offseason, we can kind of explore the studio space, so to speak. And, some of the episodes I've enjoyed the most so far have been ones where we've gone kind of a deep dive on a specific topic. Like the one I wasn't really expecting to, I don't want to say it, like I really enjoyed one of our early episodes. It was on Tampa sports, which was not something I'd particularly, given a lot of thought to in the past, but, to be able to sort of narrowly focus. So with some of these, even though they seem encompassing, like this is basically the history of professional basketball in America, we're kind of narrowly focusing it to leagues and competitions and new teams and things like that. So, I think it'll be good to have a lot of topics to choose from, but then to be able to really zero in on a topic once we've selected it for that week.
Absolutely. All right. So shall we start with the history of rival basketball leagues in the United States?
Yes, let's get into that. And just as we sort of start, basketball is kind of a weird one with, baseball is almost its own category because the history of baseball is part of American folklore. Literally, there's origin story fables about baseball and Abner Doubleday and things like that that are almost akin to George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. There's some sort of moral in there. Football is almost easy to do. It's like professional football sprung up in tiny Midwestern towns, and it wasn't something to take seriously. And then it evolved with teams like the Bears and the Packers and the Giants. And then hockey, to an extent, is just like it was Canada and anywhere it was cold, and that was hockey. Basketball is a little different. We always, as we'll talk about some of this, like basketball was invented by one guy. It wasn't evolved like a lot of other sports. It was a guy who sat down and wrote up a bunch of rules. And then the early leagues and the early NBA, it was a lot of teams in towns in upstate New York. And being from sort of the border of what you would consider upstate New York, I would always joke that like they were basically 1 degree away from Poughkeepsie having a team. Mm-hmm. But you look at some of the teams, the Rochesters of the world, and you kind of remark at how different, and Syracuse and places like that, and how different the NBA was in terms, and all the basketball leagues were, and that it's a lot more disparate in terms of the different leagues and things like that. So
where do you want to start?
So what I have written down as I turn my pages is just to sort of, the way I look at it, I wrote down right at the top to sort of set the stage, and then we can go backwards, is the first NBA season, which was the BAA, but it, was basically the NBA. The 1946-1947 season And the teams you have were first season Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Toronto. All of those teams lasted basically 1 year. They lasted just one season. And then St. Louis, Chicago, Washington, Providence, those were teams that were around for a couple of years. And the only teams from them that really survived, and if I'm wrong on any of this, please correct me, were the Warriors, who are now in Golden State but still referred to as the Warriors, the Knicks, and the Celtics from that very first NBA season, BAA season.
In 46-47.
Yes.
That is correct. There's some interesting sort of interplay, and I think, like you said, I think we're going to go backwards and we're going to talk about some of the other leagues. The NBA counts the 46-47 BAA season, which was the Basketball Association of America. They count that as their sort of their official beginning when they celebrated their 50th year or their 50th anniversary in the 90, that would have been the 96, 97 season. Much like the NFL with the APFA, which we talked about in our 1920 episode, the NBA considers the BAA in 46-47 as the beginning of what they know as NBA basketball. So I think it's next season, probably in 21-22, the NBA will celebrate its 75th anniversary. Keep in mind that it wasn't known as the NBA quite yet. That was a couple of years off, and we'll talk about why that was in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so that was the first season that sort of gets recognized, but like everything else, you know, I don't want to keep comparing it to baseball, but baseball is the one where it's most familiar, at least to me. You know, you could trace modern era baseball back to to several different points. Do you say 1903 when the first World Series was? Do you say the founding of the National League in the 1870s? And then there's sort of varying degrees of, there's different schools of thought about whether stuff before that counts. So for the NBA and professional basketball, it's sort of, okay, everybody agrees that by the 46-47 season, we had what we would consider the lineage to modern professional basketball. But that obviously wasn't the beginning of basketball that would be considered professional. The first one I have written down is the ABL. Is there anything before that chronologically that we should touch on?
No, I actually didn't even have that. So why don't we go ahead with that one?
Okay, so what I have is the ABL, which was the American Basketball League. Lucky for them, that was what it was called because it matches up with the initials. From 1925, that's a terrible joke, but so that league was from 1925 to 1955. It had 6 seasons from 25 to 31, and then sort of restarted pretty quickly after that. It was founded by the president of the recently founded 3-year-old National Football League. It was by Joseph Carr. And then George Hallis was the owner of the Chicago Bruins, and department store Max Rosenblum, a part owner of the NFL's Cleveland Bulldogs, financed the Cleveland Rosenblums. I can guess where they got their name from. And then you even had future NFL owner George Preston Marshall, who at the time was an owner of a chain of laundries, was the owner of the Washington Palace 5. And then there were other teams in Boston, Brooklyn, Buffalo, Detroit, Fort Wayne, and Rochester. The league was divided into 2 halves. Outside of 1 year, they played like a winner of the first half played the winner of the second half in a 5-game championship. And this was the league where, and I'll actually test you how much you know about this. 5 games into the 1926-27 season, the Brooklyn team was replaced by a team. And the reason I ever even heard of this team was because when I went to see LaSalle play in Northeastern in Boston, 7-8 years ago, I saw the LaSalle basketball team play an away game at Northeastern, and they were talking about the building Northeastern plays basketball in is also a hockey arena, and it's got some history to it. And it was the home of this team at one point, which was the original Celtics.
Mm-hmm.
and that I had not really been too familiar with them and their existence prior to that.
The original Celtics were a team based in New York City. They are, I believe, the entire team has been inducted into the Hall of Fame. I think and they were a team that was based in New York City area. One of their top players was a guy by the name of Nat Holman, who later went on to great fame as the coach of CCNY for almost 40 years, and he was the coach of he's in the Hall of Fame, and he was the coach of CCNY City College of New York when they had the whole point shaving scandal in 1950 and that type of thing. So other players who played on those original Celtics, Joe Lapchick, who would go on to coach not only St. John's on 2 different tenures, but also the Knicks of the 40s and 50s that went to the finals a bunch of times. So they were sort of the original great basketball team, and the team as a whole, which the Basketball Hall of Fame does this, unlike baseball or football, the team as a whole was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1959. I'm not going to say that I know a lot about these original Celtics, but if you sort of are around basketball history, you tend to hear about the original Celtics, and they are sort of the first prominent team. And I would assume, although I don't know this for a fact, served as the inspiration for the actual Boston Celtics that came into being in the mid-1940s.
So just a couple of things on this league, sort of innovations that, again, you kind of don't think that stuff like this needs to be innovated, but it obviously does. This is an aside, but I'll get back to the league in a second. I never realized, if you read the original rules of basketball, and it's kind of funny you can almost do it like when you hear about the Constitution in the U.S., where it's like, you won't find that in the original rules of basketball. It doesn't say anything about dribbling in the original rules of basketball.
I knew that.
It says you can't run with the ball. So the first 2 days that basketball existed, for the most part, what guys would do is just throw it up in the air and catch it as they ran. And I guess within a couple of days, they were like, no, you have to bounce it. Because I think they envisioned just that you would pass it and never advance it with it in your hands. I think that was what Naismith envisioned. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so to get back to a little more modern times with this league, from a business standpoint, they made players sign contracts. And then from a league standpoint, it says backboards were mandatory, which backboards existed, but it wasn't necessarily a thing that was a staple of every basketball game or, organized game even. New rules such as 3-second lane violations and foul outs were implemented. Another rule the ABL implemented was the collegiate rule, which eliminated the double dribble. So, some early innovations took place in this league, things that we probably take for granted that there was a time they never existed. But I guess a double dribble, somebody had to decide you can't do that twice. You know what I mean? So that was what happened in the ABL. So they were around for a while in the late 20s into the early 30s, and then there was a 2-year break. And then they came back in 33 and lasted 55. Some of the teams, the Baltimore Bullets, who then joined the BAA. Now, they're not linear to the current Washington Wizards, previously Washington Bullets, Baltimore Bullets, but that's obviously where they got the name from. And then there was teams in Bridgeport, Boston, Brooklyn, several teams in Brooklyn, Carbondale, Pennsylvania, which is, I believe, on the short list for an expansion team next. So lots of Northeastern teams, that kind of thing. The Manchester British Americans. So anyway, that was the ABL. That was kind of the first one I had written down. 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Or I guess by the mid-50s, it was gone as the NBA, really took off.
You forgot my favorite team from the 1930-31 season.
Who's that?
Do you have the list in front of you?
See, I'm looking at the more modern one. Let me go back to the 30-31 season.
See if you can figure out what my favorite team is from the 1930-31 season.
All right, let me see. Because I have the list of all of them, so I'm just from that era, so I got to find a team. They were only in the league 1 year?
That's what it says.
Okay. I'm just going to read this Think about how many different parts of this. I'll say the name, but before that, there's a show Community that I really like, and it was like the original mascot's name was the Greendale Drunken Savages, and then they changed it, but to something equally as offensive, but somehow more enlightened. It was like the Greendale, like Red Businessmen or something like that. So the name of this team was the Toledo Red Men Tobaccos.
And which I think that was probably named after Red Man Tobacco, right?
By the way, they won the league in 1929-30 in the end. They were in the NDL in 1929-30. But so the ABL, some, all jokes aside, some early innovations. It was obviously by modern standards sort of a very rudimentary league, but basketball was only like 40 years old at this point. So, for a league to last 30 years, even modestly, is pretty impressive.
And I don't know, wasn't able to find in my research what led them to fold in the 1950s, but you got to figure by the 1950s, the NBA was the NBA. I mean, guys like Bob Cousy and Bob Pettit and Dolph Schayes, all-time greats of the NBA were already in the league at this point, and this other league is sort of kicking around. It's just funny how sort of like we've talked about, this will now be probably in a lot of ways the third conversation like this that we've had. We talked about the birth of the NFL, and then in the same episode or the same series, we talked about the birth of the Negro National League. Both of those were centered around the Midwest, whereas this early basketball, professional basketball, at least this league, very much centered around New York in specific, and then New Jersey, New England, to a lesser extent, maybe a little bit of the Midwest, but very New York centric from the beginning.
Yeah. Kind of the opposite of football, like we talked about, where expanding to the East Coast, professional football, expanding to the East Coast was seen as a must-have. This was really all some of these leagues had, even in markets that, even at the time, New Britain, Connecticut was not what you would consider a professional sports market, or really a market of any kind.
So I think if you really want to talk about the actual sort of genesis of what we know as the NBA, you have to start with the National Basketball League, the NBL, which started playing in 1937.
Yep. So the NBL, one thing I did think, well, what I have listed as the teams who sort of came from the NBL, this is where we got the Lakers, the Royals, who then became the Kings much later, the Pistons, the Hawks, who still exist even though they've moved around a million times, and the Nationals, who were the Syracuse Nationals and are now known as the Philadelphia 76ers.
Correct. So founded in 1937 created by General Electric, GE, Firestone.
He was a World War I hero, right?
Who?
General Electric?
Oh, God. Incorrect. It was founded by GE, Firestone, and Goodyear. And as you might expect from an electrical company and two tire companies, this one was very much based in the Midwest. And it was a lot of guys who worked for those companies during the day and then played in the league sort of during off hours. I'll give you a list of some of the early teams. The Akron Firestone Non-Skids, so named after tires. The Akron Goodyear Wingfoots. And isn't the Wingfoot, that's the Goodyear logo, isn't it? So you had the Columbus Athletic Supply, the Oshkosh All-Stars, the Indianapolis Kautskys, Kautskys. I have to admit, I don't know what exactly that means.
Polish.
Yeah, it probably is, obviously Midwest, 1930s, probably very Polish, Central European type of thing. And they sort of struggle along, but they do evolve as teams go on. You mentioned some of the teams that in one way or another get their start there. Bob DeVries, who is a Hall of Famer and considered one of the early stars of the NBA, he gets his start in the NBL, wins an MVP award with that league. George Mikan plays his first 2 years in the NBL, first with the Chicago Gears for 1 year, and then with the Minneapolis Lakers. The Minneapolis Lakers actually start off for 1 season in the NBL, and then they defect to the BAA in the mid-40s.
Yeah, I saw that here. That I didn't realize that, but that they had actually sort of, as a whole team, jumped into the BAA at, while both leagues were still going on. I can't really think of, with baseball and football and things like that, you always hear about players, but you don't hear about a whole team sort of jumping. And I know it was a much different era, but, it was especially with a star the magnitude of George Mikan, who became the earliest star of the NBA. You have to imagine that was a monumental shift in sort of the power balance, such as it was for the BAA or for professional basketball.
4 teams leave the NBL for the BAA in the 48-49 season. I want to see if I can get a list of who those teams were. Fort Wayne, which becomes the Pistons. Minneapolis, which becomes the Lakers, which is the Lakers, and later becomes the LA Lakers. The Rochester Royals, who you mentioned them briefly. The Rochester Royals later become the Cincinnati Royals. They then become the Kansas City Kings, and then the Kansas City Omaha Kings, and then eventually just the Sacramento Kings. And then the Indianapolis franchise does fold after a couple of years. But 3 of those teams, NBA teams, which exist even to this day, get their start in the NBL and then jump to the BAA for the 48-49 season. A couple things I want to mention about the NBL. They only had 10-minute quarters, so when the BAA came in the mid-1940s, they, in addition to just flat out encouraging teams to defect from one league to the other, the BAA tries to compete by going to 12-minute quarters. They actually even briefly flirt with 15-minute quarters, but they soon realize that would just be too much. So they only do 12-minute quarters, which is a change. Basketball games had not been that long previously.
Yeah, and that's another one where you kind of think, oh, well, of course games would be that long. But you think about, there's a big difference in college games being 40 minutes versus professional games being 48 minutes. That's a significant difference, and in terms of how it's organized. So, a lot of these things that we take for granted now in terms of sort of standards of rules and things like that they had to start somewhere is kind of the point. What was your second point on this? Because I don't want to step on you with my point.
I think the other thing I was going to mention is that much like with some of these other leagues that we talked about, the Negro leagues and the football, early on, the teams are sort of in charge of their own booking. So there is sort of a loose confederation of a league, but teams are also scheduling games against non-league opponents. And so it's this weird hybrid, sort of like we saw in the early days of the NFL.
Yeah, where it's one of the things we consider as a league now is everybody plays a standard schedule, and it might not, in baseball they call it an unbalanced schedule where you play a lot of teams in your division, and different things this year with obviously with COVID and having to schedule different pods and things in hockey and all of this. We consider it like, well, you're not a league if you're not playing a standard schedule and if everybody's not playing the same number of games and things like that. But these were things that, even in the 40s, what we're talking about here, professional team sports were still a fairly new concept. And really, baseball was the only one that was doing it. I guess by the 40s, football was doing it too. But some of the rules we think of really didn't, I don't mean rules on the court or the field, but who says you can't have a league if everybody plays different numbers of games? You know, now we're so ingrained that no, it's not a league then. But back then it was like, hey, we'll play whoever we can play, and you know, we'll just whatever the booker like can get us, I guess, and tells us what to do, we'll just play those teams.
Absolutely. A couple of other things in 42-43, I think probably based due to player shortages because of the war, several of the NBL teams integrate, which they're not the first professional sports teams to integrate because the NFL had briefly been integrated in the 1920s, but by the 40s, there were no more black players, and that doesn't come along until the mid-1940s, and a rival league to the NFL, which is the AAFC, start to bring in some black players. So that's something worth noting. And then in 1945-46, the 45-46 season, which is interestingly enough the last year before the BAA is founded, the Rochester Royals win the NBL championship. And do you know who one of the players is on the Rochester Royals in 1945-46?
I do not know.
Otto Graham.
Oh, wow.
So Otto Graham, the future quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, is a player on the Rochester Royals, and in winning the championship with the Royals, and he obviously goes on to win a ton of championships with the Cleveland Browns in both the AAFC and the NFL. He's one of only two players in American sports to win championships in two different professional leagues. Now, a guy like a Deion Sanders was on a Braves team that went to, I think, maybe not a game 7, but at least a game 6 of a World Series. So others have had the chance to do it, but Otto Graham is one of only two guys in American sports to win championships in two different professional leagues.
One thing I did want to point out, going back to the integration in the early 40s, apparently at one point it says the Chicago had stocked its rosters with members of the Harlem Globetrotters, who I know we talked about a little when we were doing the in memoriam about Curly Neal, who passed away, who worked at the Studebaker plant during the week. So they actually, when they were looking to fill their team and you know, go that route, probably not knowing too much about black basketball, the first thing that probably came to their mind was, well, the Harlem Globetrotters seem to win all the time. Let's just get some of those guys. So I don't know how thrilled they all would have been when they were told they had to work at the Studebaker plant to play on the team. But, I mean, maybe they were. Who knows?
So the story, one of the big stories of these early days is George Mikan. Mikan, who gets his start with the Chicago Gears. Mikan is from the Chicago area and stars at DePaul, and then goes on and plays 1 year with the Chicago Gears, and then I believe they fold, and Mikan ends up on the Minneapolis Lakers, plays 1 year with them in the NBL, and then the Lakers as a whole jump to the BAA, and they're in a really strange situation here where the NBL is the one with all of the good players, but what develops with guys like Mikan in Minneapolis and that type of thing is that the NBL has the players but the BAA, which has its first year in 46, 47, they're the ones with the cities. They're the ones with the teams in New York, Boston, the major cities, Philadelphia, I believe, the major cities of the Northeast. And so that, I think, more than anything, is what makes the merger necessary. The BAA comes about because you have a bunch of hockey owners who are looking for ways to fill their arenas when the hockey team is out of town.
Yeah, and you hear about that a lot of times with, you know, just to sort of underscore how low basketball was on the pecking order, you know, as we go forward into like the NBA, you hear about, you know, for the Knicks, the New York Knicks, who we could certainly make fun of the current New York Knicks, but they're a valuable brand and, you know, they were a cornerstone franchise of the NBA. And if you watch like a history of the Knicks DVD, they talk about, and then every year for 3 weeks, the circus was in town. So the Knicks had to go play at like the basement of some Catholic school or something like that. So, stuff that would never have been thought of, but in a lot of ways, basketball was just kind of like, we got the building and we can, set up a court when we're not using it for other things.
The NBL in the 46-47 season does something really, really interesting, which is that even though there had been a regular season and even though there had been a playoffs, after the playoffs are held, they decide that they're just going to award the championship to the team with the best regular season record. There's no rhyme or reason to why they do that. And I believe it was Mikan's Chicago Gears who win the playoffs. But for whatever reason, the league authorities had decided that for that season, the team with the best regular season record would be crowned the official championship. So that ends up being Rochester, which has Otto Graham as the aforementioned future Browns quarterback. And so Rochester, despite losing the regular season head-to-head meeting with the Gears and losing to them in the playoff finals, were declared the NBL champion. And nothing I read could explain why exactly that was done.
And I'm sure the answer is something having to do with them not getting along with the owner who rightfully should have had his team's championship, who actually won the playoffs. Since you mentioned playoffs, it is interesting to me that sort of basketball has always been a playoff sport. If you think back to the time frame we're talking about, football existed for a long time before there was any kind of playoffs, and then there was an NFL championship game, but there was no, until really the mid-'60s, there was no NFL playoffs except the championship game. There was no, unless there was a tie, it was just whoever won each division played in the NFL championship game, and then when the leagues merged, that sort of created a playoff system. In baseball, there was no playoff system at all outside of the World Series until the 1969 season, and then they resisted going even further until 1995. Basketball, as early as, the 40s, was kind of like, let's just have a bunch of teams make the playoffs. So it was always it's kind of unique among sports in that era.
So one of the things that the BAA wants to do is they want to differentiate themselves from the NBL, and they probably start the league maybe with the merger in mind, because the NBL doesn't want a war with the BAA, but the BAA very much wants to differentiate itself from the NBL. And here are some of the suggestions that they thought of. We talked about the 15-minute quarters. They also talked about having innings, with one team having the ball for 2 minutes, then the other team getting the ball for the next 2 minutes. Now, I have no idea how that would work once you scored. Would it be like a pickup game? You'd take the ball.
It'd be like probably an inbounds in the front court, I guess.
Yes, very strange. And if the other team stole the ball, would they be able to have a transition, or would they just stop? I don't have any idea. And then another thought, and this is actually an interesting one, they thought to wait until the end of the quarter to shoot all the free throws to prevent the stoppages of action that came from all the fouls. I actually think that might be kind of neat to see.
Yeah, I've always not said this with regards to basketball, but you find yourself in a lot of arguments with people, and it's almost always one-sided, where it's people who love hockey and decide to hate, prove how much they love hockey by going after other sports, specifically basketball. And it's the one thing I will say is I do kind of wish that basketball had evolved in such a way where, and it's worse in college, but the same in the pros. It would be nice if it had evolved in a way where the end of every close game isn't just nonstop fouling. You know what I mean? As much as I don't like a lot of the arguments that people make against basketball, and sometimes I think they're racially tinged, and sometimes I just think they're, lazy arguments from people who don't watch basketball or whatever, the knock of at the end of every game, it takes a million years because they just inbound and foul. that's a legitimate knock. You know what I mean? So something like that would have been interesting and would have certainly altered how basketball is played today.
And I've always thought, too, that we allow fouling when a team's up 6 points or down 6 points and there's 11 seconds left and they foul. That's the type of thing that I think would like to see discouraged.
There should be some sort of formula where, like, if you're down a certain amount with a certain amount left, and it would basically if it would be the greatest comeback in the history of basketball, you shouldn't be allowed to do it. Like, it should just be like, oh, the other team should be able to, like, decline the shots and just keep the ball or something like that. But this is a digression, but
it is. So, led by the desire to meld the star players with the big cities, the NBL, the National Basketball League, and the BAA, the Basketball Association of America, merge in 1949 to form the NBA, the National Basketball Association. And the 1949-50 season is the first season of officially known as the NBA, and it is a 17-team league with a 65-game schedule. Many of those teams do not last past the 1949-50 season, and in fact, before the 50-51 season, 6 teams fold, and those being the Anderson Packers, who are based in Anderson, Indiana. Those be the Sheboygan Redskins, not like the Washington Redskins. This is two words, Sheboygan Redskins.
I don't think that was the problem.
And the Waterloo, Iowa Hawks all jump to another, the National Professional Basketball League, which only lasts for
1 year.
For 1 year.
I have that up here, just some of the teams in that. You had the Packers, the Sheboygan Redskins, the Louisville Alumnites, Grand Rapids Hornets, Denver Definers, St. Paul Lights, Kansas City High Spots, and the Waterloo Hawks.
And the other 3 teams that leave the NBA before the 50-51 season are the Chicago Stags, the Denver Nuggets. It's really 1950 to have a professional sports team in Denver is just that seems a little early, given that there wouldn't even be a team in, there were barely teams in LA or San Francisco at this point, and to have a team in Denver in 1949, 1950 is just crazy.
And I think that's something to underline when you were talking before about, well, the BAA had the big cities and stuff. Big cities obviously matter today. You hear about leagues and, if a New York team is involved or LA. Actually, cities matter less than media markets, but, generally big cities translate to big media markets, although it's not always a one-to-one comparison. But even more so back then, prior to World War II and then in the couple of years after World War II, you were dealing with a time when the suburbs weren't what we recognize them as today. So you basically had the country and then the cities, and such a higher percentage of the population lived in cities, and such a higher percentage of the population lived in northeastern cities or, Midwestern cities. So being a big deal, there's a reason the Major League Baseball was able to get away for 50 years with 16 teams, and what were they in, 11 cities or something like that, the 16 teams in the Major League Baseball for 50 years?
I think that's right.
Yeah, and a lot of them, it was 2 teams in the same city because so much of the population was concentrated in the sort of Boston to DC and no farther west than Chicago or St. Louis. So to have a team in Denver in that back then, Denver was probably comparable to what we'd consider a medium-sized town today.
Rochester.
Yeah. Rochester was probably bigger at the time.
I bet it was. So they lose the 6 teams. They also, midway through the season, they lose the Washington Capitals, which brings the number of teams in the league down to 10. And then a couple years later, they lose the Indianapolis Olympians. And then a couple of years later, the Baltimore Bullets. So by the mid-50s, you have the 8 NBA teams that would form sort of the core of the league for the next 10 years or so until they start to expand.
So I feel like that's a good transition into the NBA and to sort of talk about their teams and their sort of early expansion and relocation and take that up until we get to the biggest sort of alternate league of all time for the NBA.
There is one other competitive league that I want to touch on briefly.
ABA before. I mean, I was talking about the trampoline basketball league in like 2003 that was on, I think it was on Spike TV. So was that not what you were thinking of?
No, I wanted to talk briefly about the ABL, which lasted for only one season in the early 1960s. Are you familiar with the ABL?
I don't believe I have them listed here, no.
So the ABL was founded by Abe Saperstein, who was also the owner of the Harlem Globetrotters, and he was upset that he had been denied an LA team for the NBA, so he decides to form his own rival basketball league for the 61-62 season, and the star team and the team that wins the only championship is the Cleveland Pipers. And they have an owner.
I know the owner.
The owner who made his money in the shipbuilding industry, and that would be George M. Steinbrenner III.
Yes. And I knew he had been involved in a basketball league, and the team was the Cleveland Pipers. I did not automatically associate it with that league.
Steinbrenner is known for selling a player at halftime during one game, trading him, I think, to the team that they were playing against. The first coach of the Cleveland Pipers is John McClendon, who was the first African-American coach of a major pro basketball team. He does not last the season. He is eventually fired by Steinbrenner, and later asked if he thought Steinbrenner was anti-black. He said, no, Steinbrenner is anti-everybody. And so he doesn't find any racial undertones, I should say, in the fact that he was fired. But like many a Yankee manager to come, he is fired mid-season. Bill Sharman ends up taking over the great Boston Celtic of the 1950s, and in the only season of the ABL, the Cleveland Pipers win the championship. Steinbrenner had wanted to defect the following year to the NBA, and in fact, he signs Jerry Lucas to a $40,000 contract, and he has a secret deal with the NBA commissioner. The Pipers, Steinbrenner's team, are going to merge with the Kansas City team and join the NBA. And in fact, a schedule is even printed with the Pipers playing the Knicks in the first game. But the ABL sues to block the move, and Steinbrenner and his team have no league, and they eventually fold. And then the ABL lasts only half of another season. They fold mid-season. So this whole experiment lasts only a year and a half, but we only almost have a George Steinbrenner team with Jerry Lucas, who was a great college player and a great pro. But and think about how different things would have been had Steinbrenner been able to succeed.
Yeah, the sports universe in this city and really the country would be a much different place now. Before we move on, I did want to go back to, it was the bottom link on my page, or on my sheet of links here. The earliest pro basketball league, and I'm using the word pro very loosely, was the first one I could find was also called the National Basketball League. It existed from 1898 to 1904. And for context, James Naismith invented basketball in 1891. So this was a league 7 years after the sport existed. Began operations in 1898 to 1899 season. It was originally intended to consist of two separate geographic districts, one based in Philadelphia, the other in New York. The New York district never got off the ground. Had teams at the Trenton Nationals, the Hancock Athletic Association, Millville, New Jersey Glass Blowers, the Camden Electrics, the Trenton Nationals, Pennsylvania. I'll come back to this. The Bristol Pile Drivers, Chester, PA, the New York Wanderers. My favorite team name, which I do believe the Sixers should have a throwback jersey for this team, the Pennsylvania Bicycle Club. And that just is a name for a basketball team, is the Pennsylvania Bicycle Club. But anyway, that was the earliest example of any sort of a pro league I could find.
So right about the time that the ABL and George Steinbrenner are having their one shining year, the NBA is starting to expand. And it's funny, actually, the first two times that they expand in the 1960s, they do so in Chicago. They start off with a team known as the Chicago Packers, which eventually, now the Chicago Packer team is very interesting, and I can sort of speak to this a little bit firsthand because the Chicago Packers eventually become what is now the Washington Wizards. They start off as the Chicago Packers in 1961 as a nod to the meatpacking industry, but then after 1 year they changed its name. They changed their name to the Chicago Zephyrs, which is, go ahead, I'm sorry.
You and I were at a Wizards game one night, Wizards Knicks, when I lived in DC, where they were giving out stuff about the Zephyrs.
You know, I remember that. I didn't remember that it was a game I was at with you, but the Wizards will occasionally wear Zephyrs throwback uniforms, which is just really, it's a very crazy thing to see. So that team goes to Baltimore and then become the Bullets, and then eventually the Washington Bullets, and then eventually the Wizards, and everybody knows that whole story. But the first expansion team is into Chicago, only lasts a couple of years, and then strangely enough, and this is something I don't think you'd ever see today, in 66, the NBA expands again, this time to 10 teams, and they go into Chicago again with the Chicago Bulls.
And the Chicago Packers go right up on the list with the short-lived pro football team, the Boston Yanks, of the short-sighted idea of naming a team in your city after the biggest rival of that city in a sport.
It's a good point.
Like at least with the Boston Yanks, it was like really, really early. By 1961, the Packers-Bears rivalry was pretty well established
For 40 years.
Yeah, and they both I get what they're the meatpacking industry, but like it's not a surprise after a year they had to change that.
So in the late 60s and 67, you get the San Diego Rockets, who eventually evolve into the Houston Rockets, as well as the Seattle Supersonics, who were around for 40 years before they moved to Oklahoma City. It's funny to think Seattle was in the league before the Milwaukee Bucks, before Cleveland. You don't think necessarily of Seattle as being one of the early expansion teams, but they were.
Well, and that's one of the things I wanted to point out about sort of the early NBA expansion. You had, or expansions or moves. You had places like San Diego, Phoenix, Seattle, New Orleans, Milwaukee. These are not cities that have a ton of other teams at the time the NBA went in there. And you still see that to an extent, where there's a lot of NBA teams in cities with either one or maybe two professional teams. You still to this day, you talk about Portland is the only professional team in Portland of the big four. Sacramento, San Antonio. These are places that's Utah, Salt Lake City, Oklahoma City. The NBA has always sort of, going back to the 60s or 70s, expanded into places where they've and even like a place like Denver that now has 4 teams. The Nuggets were the second team there. And I know that was folded in from the ABA, which we'll talk about, but they were kind of ahead of a lot of the same thing with Phoenix. They were the first team in Phoenix, and then you had the Cardinals move there, and then the expansion teams and the other sports. In a lot of those cities, the NBA was the first one there.
Yeah,
and there's more.
That is, and I mean, in some like Portland, they're still the only one there. Sacramento.
Yeah, Orlando, if you think about it. There's plenty of them, but it started early too. And actually, never mind. I was going to say they're now, because the Chargers are gone, they're one of only 2 teams in San Diego, but they haven't been in San Diego for a long time. That was a stupid comment. So you can feel free to edit that out too.
Sure.
I'll start singing Beatles songs, so it's a copyright thing, and you have to edit it out.
So right about by the time the NBA is at 14 teams, in 1967, you get the American Basketball Association, which the entire goal, you come to find out, is they form this league with the hopes of bringing out a merger. And it's kind of timed. If you look at the timing, it makes a lot of sense because it was only a year or so after the NFL had agreed to eventually merge with the AFL. So that's sort of what's behind it is let's come up with this new league, much like the AFL. It'll be colorful. It'll be sort of renegade, and with the eventual hope of merging with the NBA and getting some owners' NBA franchises that might not otherwise have them. The original teams are the Anaheim Amigos, the Dallas Chaparrals, Houston Mavericks, Indiana Pacers, the Denver Rockets, Kentucky Colonels, Minnesota Muskies, New Orleans Buccaneers, New York Americans, Oakland Americans, and the Pittsburgh Pipers and the San Diego Conquistadors. I believe that the Oakland Americans become the Oakland Oaks almost immediately. So I don't know how long they're actually called that, but
the chart I have here it doesn't even have, there's a tiny 1 pixel wide sliver before it says Oakland Oaks. It's like when you look at a map of the US and they have to blow out Rhode Island because there's not enough room to write Rhode Island on the map.
Uh-huh.
So it probably not surprisingly that 3 of these are teams that 3 of the 4 I'm about to mention are teams that ended up in the NBA, but the only teams that really were the same throughout in terms of the same city and the same name or close to that are the Pacers, the Nuggets, the Kentucky Colonels, and the Nets. Now, I know the Nets were the New York Americans, or excuse me, the New Jersey Americans, right? Yeah.
They started off as the New York Americans. I don't know how long they actually were that.
They were the New Jersey Americans, and then they became the New York Nets. But I'll even count that as similar. But, I mean, you look at some of these teams, and you have the Minnesota Muskies became the Miami Floridians, who then just became the Floridians. The New Orleans Buccaneers became the Memphis Pros, who became the Memphis Tams, who became the Memphis Sounds, who became the Baltimore Claws. There was a lot of turnover here. Anaheim Amigos, Los Angeles Stars, Utah Stars. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that some of the more stable franchises are the ones, and we'll talk about why and how the end of the ABA came about, but it was very transient, I think it's fair to say.
So a couple of the things that they do, they allow players to come out early. And so that's how you get guys like Moses Malone, who comes directly from high school, let alone coming out early from college. They allow guys who either don't go to college or don't finish college. They also allow, one of the early things that they do, there's a player named Connie Hawkins who was implicated in a point shaving scandal, but it sort of comes out through the years that he probably didn't actually do anything wrong and had been a young man who was manipulated by the people, whether it was the U.S. attorney or the police or whoever was investigating this, and he confessed to something that maybe he shouldn't have confessed to, and that type of thing. It's a whole story that I'm not doing justice to, and he ends up blackballed from the NBA for a number of years. I think he actually plays in that 1 year of the ABL. I could be wrong about that, but a guy like him finds a home in the ABA. The other thing that they do is they take steps to liven up the game. You see the ABL in 62 had used a 3-point line, and the ABA adopts that. They very famously have the red, white, and blue ball. Do you know whose idea the red, white, and blue ball was?
I feel like I've heard this, but I can't remember it now.
So this is sort of interesting. The first commissioner of the
I do want to point out he did play that year in the ABL. He was with the Pittsburgh Wrens, and he was named the league's most valuable player.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the league folded, he went and played for 4 years with the Globetrotters.
So that's Connie Hawkins.
Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
So the first commissioner of the ABA is George Mikan, who we talked about a little, the first superstar in NBA history. And it's always funny because George Mikan is this tall, lanky guy. He's got glasses. He's just sort of...
It looks like Buddy Holly, basically. Like
he looks like Buddy Holly, and he's just... Whenever anybody talks about sort of the NBA before... I mean, I guess just be blunt. The NBA before black players started to dominate, George Mikan is the one they always mention because this sort of tall, lumbering white guy who couldn't really run and couldn't really jump was the dominant player in the league. And it's always sort of, this was the NBA before it was cool. It's the NBA before it was high flying. And Mikan is sort of seen as the epitome of that early 1950s conservative, boring NBA. To think of him 10 or 12 years later as the commissioner of the ABA, it doesn't really fit. But he's actually the one.
It's Shana Na playing at Woodstock.
That's a good point. That's a good way to look at it. That's a good point.
For those of you who don't know, Shana Na, I mean, I'm honestly going to guess most people who listen to a sports history podcast also know who Shana Na is. But Shana Na was very like 50s doo-wop, the duck's ass hairdo and the leather jackets and whatever. And for some reason, they ended up at Woodstock. And they literally played right before the last set of the night. They played like before Hendrix came out at 3:00 in the morning or whatever, or whatever it was to end Woodstock. So that's kind of the comparison I thought of.
The owners come to Mikan. They want to make him the commissioner. He refuses to move to New York, so they decide to put a team in Minneapolis where Mikan lives, so that there'll at least be a team in the same city as where the commissioner is. And the red, white, and blue ball is actually Mikan's idea, and he says that he has always had bad eyes, and when he watches the game on TV, it's hard for him to pick up the ball, so he decides to have a red, white, and blue ball, and that in some ways becomes sort of the symbol of the ABA. And even to this day, when you see somebody with a red, white, and blue ball, they say, oh, that's the old ABA ball. Connie Hawkins says, quote, when the ball came out, all the guys would have turnovers because when they threw you the ball, it would rotate and you couldn't tell if the ball was far or close. So it took us about 2 months to get used to the ball. And so there's
this was the late 60s. A lot of them were probably stoned if they couldn't tell if the ball was far or close. But
yeah, who knows? I mean, I don't know. I mean, at that speed.
It's not something you ever considered before. The ball was always a certain color, and now it wasn't. So I get it. I was just joking, but
then Spencer Haywood, another guy who plays in the NBA, says, once you shoot, you know everything that you've done wrong with your shot because the rotation in the red, white, and blue. If it spins wrong, you just know it. And then Rick Barry said, that ball sucked. It had hard edges. It would get slick at times. It was a great gimmick, but quality-wise, the ball was horrible. So the ball is probably the most lasting symbol of what the ABA was. It was also just incredibly easy to get a franchise in the NBA. One of the early executives says the price range for a team was about low 7 figures, but in reality, if you had $100,000 and put up a letter of credit, we grabbed you and pulled you into the room. We had guys that came out of the woodwork. We had a dentist that owned a team in San Diego. We had a cable TV operator that was just starting in Utah. So just guys just coming into the league. Pat Boone, the famous, I don't know what you want to call Pat Boone. He's sort of a country soft rock singer of the 19th.
Took a lot of songs that black artists had recorded first and then recorded a bunch of them, and they got more popular when he released them.
Yeah, there was a little bit of that with him. He owns the Oakland team, but strangely enough, players start to defect to the ABA. Rick Barry defects to the Nets. George Gervin is drafted and plays first with the Virginia Squires and then with the San Antonio Spurs. Spencer Haywood joins the NBA instead of the ABA instead of the NBA. Moses Malone comes right out of high school and goes first to Utah and then to St. Louis. But it really sort of starts when Julius Erving, instead of going to the NBA, decides to go to the ABA, starting with the Virginia Squires and then obviously most famously with the New York Nets.
Yeah, and you talked about the ball being sort of the contribution and one of the lasting images of the ABA. And if you want to combine the two, kind of Dr. J, what you think of with him is basic. And he had some great years on the Sixers and won a championship. What you think of with Dr. J was him in that Nets uniform with the big afro, sort of with the, going high up in the air with one hand with that red, white, and blue ball in his hand coming down. Our father grew up outside of Philadelphia, was a big Sixers fan for a long time, really liked them in the early 80s when they won that championship. But I remember growing up, anytime we'd see like highlights of him, he would say, yeah, he as good as he was with the Sixers, you should have seen him in the ABA. And getting older and seeing those highlights of him just almost seemed like he was from another planet, in terms of some of the guys he was playing with and things like that. He was a force of nature, I guess you would have to describe him as.
Yeah, and I think because, and this is something I was about to mention, they don't really have a national TV deal. So they have these sort of small, maybe one-off local TV contracts, but there's just not a lot of footage out there from Dr. J's ABA days. So it's almost become more myth than something you can really wrap your hands around. And Dr. J in the ABA is this sort of mythic thing. And everybody says, if you weren't there, you just can't understand what it was like. They say he was Jordan before Jordan.
Yeah. And you can see a lot of clips, and I know you can edit most things together, but you can see clips of him doing things, and then if they cut it together, it's like a similar play by Jordan, 25 years later or whatever, or 20 years later.
These teams, the problem is that they struggle for money almost from the beginning. That's sort of, you talked about the cities and the teams, everybody's so transient. They're in one city one year, they're in another city the next, and so they never really get the hang of things. From a financial point of view, they never really get off the ground as far as financial stability. Earl the Pearl Monroe was approached by the owner after 2 years with the Bullets. The owner of the Pittsburgh team was talking about paying him a significantly higher amount of money than he was making in the NBA, but he says that the determining factor was that they wanted to spread my payment out until 2060. And that wouldn't work. So I think Earl Monroe would have been about 120 years old when he stopped getting paid by.
And what would the pay, like, what would he be getting, a $5,000 check each year at this point? It's not like Bobby Bonilla, who still gets, a decent chunk of change today. Like,
no, that's a good point too. I'm sorry, and this is mostly from the book that ESPN did about a year ago called Basketball: A Love Story. They also did a 10-episode documentary on sort of the history of basketball. But Al Attles, who was the coach of the Golden State Warriors in the mid 1970s, coached them to a championship, I believe, in 79, I think it was. He says I'm sorry?
No, the Golden State won in 75?
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. Golden State won in 75. That was Al Attles. Golden State in 75. Correct. He said the ABA played in Oakland, and we, the Warriors, used the same facilities. We used to practice at a recreation center, so we go there the first day, and I'm the coach, and they tell us we can't practice. They say, "Aren't you the guys from the ABA?" And we say, "No, we're from the NBA." They say, "Oh, it's the ABA that owes us money." So they let us practice.
And it's not like the NBA was riding real high on the hog in 1975 either. So,
and part of the reason for that was that the talent pool had been so diluted by this competition between the leagues. The other thing that I think we should mention before we move on is that in a lot of ways, more so, two things really. First of all, it's dominated by the Indiana Pacers. The Pacers win. Now, keep in mind also that the Pacers have never won a championship in the NBA in all the years they've been in the NBA. They win 2 titles in the NBA.
ABA.
Sorry, they win 2 titles in the ABA in 72 and 73, and then they lose at least, I think, 2 more. They lose in the final. So they are the dominant team. And in fact, if you look at even to this day, when you talk about the golden years of the Indiana Pacers, it's in the ABA. I also should note that as tempting as it is for players, it's also tempting for coaches. Bill Sharman, who we mentioned previously, who had been with Steinbrenner in Cleveland and actually wins a championship with the Lakers in 72. He also later jumps to the ABA. Alex Hannum, who had coached the Philadelphia 76ers with Wilt to a championship in 1967, he jumps to the ABA. So even as the players are jumping, you see a lot of coaches jumping too. And as the 70s go on, these teams are starting to play exhibition games against each other, and there's sort of almost sort of a soft merger going on until they agree to the actual merger in 77 and 76.
There's plenty to talk about with the merger, and I do want to get into that in a second. Just a couple of things as we leave. You mentioned Dr. J and the footage that, there's not much footage left. One of the things that does survive, which adds to his lore, but also is a significant contribution to what's part of NBA culture today, is the last season of the ABA. During their All-Star break, they came up with a concept known as the slam dunk contest. And that was when Dr. J did his famous dunk from the free throw line, which you've seen repeated often, but nobody had ever really done anything like that before. That was sort of a street ball kind of thing that you just weren't seeing in the NBA at that point, especially, and definitely not in college basketball. And that's one of the things that survives. I have some sort of tape somewhere where it's got the 76 or whatever you said would have been 76. Yeah, the 76 ABA All-Star Game dunk contest on it. So that's, and that still exists to this day as sort of a cultural part of the NBA. And then the thing you can't gloss over is the three-point line. I don't know if they invented the three-point line, but they certainly popularized it, made it.
They had that in the ABL in 62 too.
Yeah, but they made it mainstream. They made it a part of the game that could not be denied. I mean, the NBA incorporated that right away, right, when they merged.
I think it took them a couple years. The first year of the three-point line was 78, 79, I believe.
So they went without it for 2 years.
Yeah.
But but they put it in pretty quick. When you consider the NFL took 20 years to adopt, or 30 years to adopt the two-point conversion from the AFL, that and now, and for a long time, that three-point line went from sort of a curiosity to a nice to have to basically it's the centerpiece of most contenders now is shooting three-point shots. So
entire offenses are built around it.
Yeah, and there's, stats that basically say if you're going to do anything but shoot a layup or a jump shot, you should shoot a 3-pointer, because shooting a long 2 percentage-wise, whatever, like that's a Babe Ruth level altering of the game. You know, how Babe Ruth, all of a sudden everybody wanted home runs. The 3-point line is kind of the same thing, and they didn't invent it, but you can be sure that it wouldn't have gotten incorporated into the NBA ever, probably, definitely not that quickly, if it wasn't for, it wouldn't have been like, well, this league that was around for 2 years did it, you know, it was the ABA was the reason there's a 3-point line.
Absolutely. So by 75, 76, by the end of the season, they're down to 7 teams. There's the Denver Nuggets, New York Nets, San Antonio Spurs, the Kentucky Colonels, Indiana Pacers, Spirits of St. Louis, and the Virginia Squires. 3 teams, well, actually 1 team folded before the season started, and then 2 teams fold relatively early into the season. The Baltimore, Utah, and San Diego all fold at some point. So they end the season with only 7 teams, and then the Virginia Squires fold immediately after that season ends. Virginia Squires played in Norfolk, Virginia, which is another one of those things where you just look and you realize that no, other than maybe something in baseball in the 1880s or something, no professional team had played in that area of the country, in that area of Virginia, ever before or since. So it's always funny to think about that, especially when you figure that they had Dr. J for a year or two, the biggest star in professional basketball. So they're down to 6 teams. They're down to Denver, the Nets, the Spurs, Kentucky Colonels, Indiana Pacers, and the Spirits of St. Louis. The Kentucky Colonels agree to be bought out relatively quickly. The NBA only wants to take 4 teams, and the St. Louis Spirits, the
Colonel's owner, by the way, took the buyout and then bought the Buffalo Braves, who are these days the Los Angeles Clippers. But that's why he took the buyout and went and bought right back into the NBA.
The Buffalo Braves, who eventually... Now, where do the Buffalo Braves go after Buffalo? They go somewhere else, right?
They went to San Diego and became the Clippers, and now they're the Los Angeles Clippers.
Okay, so there was nowhere in between. I was trying to remember there was somewhere in between Buffalo and San Diego. I don't think there was, though. But the owners of the St. Louis Spirits, they strike a little bit of a harder bargain. And I think what I've heard is that they really wanted to be in the league. They didn't want to be bought out. They wanted to have a team in the NBA, but the NBA, for whatever reason, decides that they want the other 4 teams. And so they come up with this agreement that has become almost legend in NBA history, which is that the owners of the St. Louis Spirits will hold in perpetuity 1/7 of the TV rights for the 4 ABA teams, the Spurs, the Nets, the Pacers, and the Spurs, the Nets, the Pacers, and the Nuggets. They will hold 1/7. They will get 1/7 of the TV money for those 4 teams in perpetuity. And so that ends up being, I think, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars.
So they offered the Colonels and the Spirits $3 million each to fold, which the Colonels took, which we've talked about. The Spirits did not want to take it. It was 2 brothers, Ozzie and Daniel Silna, Silna. They did not want to take that. They negotiated their own deal with their lawyer, with the NBA when their lawyer was assisting. They agreed to the following. The Silnas would be paid for any Spirits players drafted to the NBA by NBA teams, an amount that came to roughly $2.2 million. On top of that, the Silnas would also get 1/7 share of each of the former ABA teams' visual media rights. So it was 57% of a full share that every other NBA team would get. And again, they have no operating costs. They have no salaries to pay. They're nothing. They
don't have to keep the lights on.
They're a defunct entity. And, you can make the argument that, okay, it was 1976 or 75, whatever, 76. The NBA was at a lull. I mean, there was TV rights in general were outside of the NFL were nothing compared to what they are. And the NBA was also down. This was the years before Magic and Bird came in, and then let alone Jordan, and then external forces like cable television and everything else. So they struck this deal. And I'm sure there were people who were like, that was dumb. They're not ever going to make $3 million out of this. They got what was estimated to be $300 million, again, to do nothing, between that deal and where's the article? That deal and about 7 years ago, they made $300 million, on an annual basis. They were getting checks, which added up to $300 million. Every time the NBA tried to buy them out, I think I read something that in like the mid 80s, they were close to buying them out for like 50 something million dollars. And then they changed their mind at the last minute. They finally made a deal the last time before the NBA was going to renegotiate their contract in like 2015. Upfront payment, $500 million on top of the $300 million they had already made on the deal over the years. And I guess one of the reasons that I've read, I don't see it in this article, but I guess the reason they finally did it was part of the deal was like they can't bequeath it. Like it can't just continue on in their family forever. And since they're getting up there, they were like, fine, we'll just do it. You know what I mean? But that's what I read the situation was.
Yeah, and I think that's also, I don't know when the 30 for 30 came out about the Spirits of St. Louis. It was sometime, I think, probably like 2012. And I think the story ended up it was the first I had heard of it was when that 30 for 30 came out about the Spirits. I think it had gotten so much attention that the NBA was just sort of embarrassed by it. And so they were super motivated to wrap it up and get it taken care of. But that is the ABA merger in 76. And it took a while. It was not until the Spurs almost 20 years later or over 20 years later when they beat the Knicks in 99 that one of those four ABA franchises would actually win a championship.
And none of them have, other than the Spurs. The Nuggets, Nets, and Pacers all have not won championships.
So you could do a whole show. You could do a series of shows, and people have on the ABA, but they bring in those teams in the mid 70s, and all the while they're continuing to expand. They brought in the New Orleans Jazz, who later became the Utah Jazz, and then they bring in Dallas in 1980. And then I think in the late 80s is when you sort of start to see this rapid expansion. 2 teams in 88, Charlotte and Miami, 2 teams in 89, Minnesota and Orlando. They have the Canada expansion in 1995, Toronto, which has worked out great, and Vancouver, which worked out very poorly. And then in 2004, they bring in the Charlotte Bobcats to replace the Charlotte Hornets, who had moved to New Orleans. And then the Charlotte Bobcats now are the Charlotte Hornets, and that's a whole other story. So the NBA eventually gets to a very round 30 teams, and I don't know if there's any expansion coming in the future, but I wouldn't rule it out. I think they'll almost certainly go back to Seattle at some point.
And now that the NHL has broken the sort of 30 teams barrier, for quite a while we were at 32 in the NFL and then 30 teams with the other 3 leagues. Now that the NHL has gone up to 31 and they're going to be adding a team in Seattle next year to go up to 32, and they've talked like, hey, we'll go up a couple more. They've talked about that. These other cities will these other sports, basketball specifically, will most likely break that ceiling. You would imagine Seattle gets a team, and then whether it's Vegas or, there's plenty of other locations that you could argue for, but you would imagine within the next 5 years, there will at least be an announcement that 2 new teams are being added.
So I had one more kind of rival league, or not even a rival league, one other sort of professional basketball league that I wanted to touch on before we wrapped up. All right, so real quick before we wrap up, I just want to talk real quick about the Continental Basketball Association, the CBA, which is I guess you could almost call it a minor league that was around actually for over 60 years, from 1946 to 2009. this was a league that had teams in some near major cities, but also in other places, teams in places like Albany, New York. Phil Jackson got his head coaching start with the Albany Patroons of the CBA. And so that was that type of league. It was a league that was formed in 1946 under a different name, and then sort of gradually developed a relationship with the NBA, where the NBA was almost sort of a minor league to the CBA. Teams could sign players from the CBA to 10-day contracts, and then if they were not signed by the team in the NBA that had brought them in, they would then be able to go back to their CBA team. By the 90s, players from the CBA were regularly being signed by any NBA teams, and some of them went on to pretty decent careers in the NBA. Actually, one of the most prominent is a guy that we both know well, John Starks, who'd been playing with, I think it was Oklahoma City
That would make sense because you went to Oklahoma State, so that would make sense.
He'd been playing with, I think it was Oklahoma City with the CBA, and then the CBA lasts till 2009. They shut down in 2009 in the midst of the economic downturn in that year, but they almost died 10 years earlier, and that is because of the actions of the great executive who later went on to the Knicks, Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah Thomas buys the CBA in 1999. He goes on a couple weeks after buying it. He cuts player salaries by 1/3, turns down the offer from the NBA to buy it for $11 million, continues to run it for a little while longer. He then takes the offer to be head coach of the Pacers, has to place the league into a blind trust, which means no team can make any moves. And he talks about selling it to the Players Association, the NBA Players Association. That never happens. And the league eventually folds a year later, or the league eventually folds, I should say, and then they come back a year later. But by this point, the NBA has expressed its interest in no longer doing business with the CBA as a feeder league, and this is about when they're starting to come up with their own NBA development league.
The development league, which is now the G League. So that was the main blow to the CBA.
So everybody always says Isaiah Thomas ruined the CBA or he killed the CBA. That's an overstatement, but he certainly did not do a good job during his brief time in charge.
You want to hear some from 1978 to 1986? CBA Commissioner Jim Drucker created several new rules to raise fan interest, which were then adopted by the league. You want to hear some of these?
Sure.
Season standings were changed from a win-loss percentage to the 7-point system. During each game, 7 points were awarded, 3 for winning the game and 1 point for each quarter in which a team outscored their opponent. Team standings were determined by the number of points rather than win-loss percentage. So theoretically, if you outscored another team 3 quarters and lost the game, you would get 3 points and the other team would only get 4. A player cannot foul out of the game. After a player's 6th personal foul, the opposing team receives an automatic free throw. That one I don't hate in an experimental league. There are things I like in the first one is dumb. The second one, I don't hate that in an experimental league.
No, especially when you figure that you probably got 1 or 2 really good players on every team. So you don't want
people are going to be mad they came to see so-and-so when he's,
Yeah.
So during the 82-83 and 83-84 seasons, overtime games were decided by the team that scored the first 3 points in overtime. During the 84-85 season, that rule was modified so that victory went to the first team to lead by 3 points in overtime.
It's like a pickup game.
By 87-88, that rule was superseded by a regular 5-minute overtime. A couple more. 81-82 season, they created a 6x5 no-call box, an area in front of the baskets in which any contact in the box between offensive and defensive players was to be an automatic defensive foul, which is that's like how there's the no charge area now.
Yeah.
It's similar. Variation of the rule would be adopted by the NBA in 2002, which is the ARC. CBA offered a money-back guarantee. If before the start of the second quarter, the fan left the game, you could get your money back. So if you just went for the first quarter, you could leave and get your money back.
You're just like stopping off on your way home, I guess.
Fouling is okay. That's more standard. High profile, big money promotions. That's all normal. Weird stuff. The rest of it's more like promotions that you see in minor league sports. But I give him credit for trying some stuff.
Yeah, no, totally. And it was something that was around for a very long time. It was around for over 60 years, and you don't often get that with those types of leagues. So, all right. Well, this was a very fun excursion into the history of basketball leagues that have come about over the last 70 or 80 years. So, Andrew, did you have anything to add before we wrapped up?
No, I think this might be a good time to announce that you and I are starting our own professional basketball league.
And we didn't even get into all the sort of the weird things that have come about in recent years, the big three and all that type of thing. So,
yeah, an episode can only be so long.
And well, that is that should be our.
That's what they're telling us, at least.
What'd you say?
So that's what they're telling us.
All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed this. Our first episode devoted entirely to basketball, and we have a lot more of those coming. So until next time, I'm Dan Neumann.
And I'm Andrew Neumann. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.